I'm not working at the moment. I have nothing left.
We're putting our shame aside, and if our children are hungry, we'll get food for them.
The poorest people have a right to live with dignity, and the government has a pressing obligation to enshrine this right.
Hello and welcome to France in Focus. I'm Charlie James, and today we're taking a look at the economic damage from the coronavirus here in France. 2 confinements, travel bans, and months of other restrictions have upended the job market. As many as 1 million French people could be plunged into poverty, and many made a good living before COVID-19. We begin with a look at the new faces of poverty here in France.
In the wake of the COVID pandemic, NGOs estimate some 1 million people will be pushed into poverty by the end of the year in France. They come from varied backgrounds, but all are earning less than 1,060 euros per month. 3 years ago, this interior designer bought and restored an old farmhouse. It's proved a popular location for weddings and seminars. That's until COVID came along. In order to pay her mortgage and bills, Claire applied for income support.
Financially, I had to get past this barrier somehow. So it's just for a few months, and I hope that as soon as possible I'll be able to say, here's the money, there are others who need it.
Pascal is the owner of a small business in the events industry. Since the beginning of the crisis, all he's received is 1,500 euros in one-off state benefits. His turnover has already dropped by 80%. 6 out of 8 of his employees have been furloughed, and he hasn't been able to pay his own salary since March.
We won't start up again before 2021 or 2022. I have shows cancelled until November of 2021.
Pascal's health is suffering. He's lost 10 kilos, and his blood pressure is at 18.
The banks force us to be personal guarantors by committing our personal assets. That means that if tomorrow my company can't make its payments, my whole life will collapse.
It's also put a strain on his mental health.
I'm sad, obviously. I'm sorry.
Young entrepreneurs Luis and Elise are still optimistic. The inauguration of their deli and restaurant should have taken place a few days ago. But with renovation work put on hold by the recent lockdown, the young couple find themselves alone with their unfinished project.
Our business is considered too young, too recently created to be able to justify a loss of turnover.
It means they're not entitled to reschedule payments or to receive benefits. There are many others like them, left on hold. It's a climate that looks likely to last. Since the start of the health crisis, the number of French citizens receiving state benefits has increased by 9%, while the unemployment rate is expected to hit 11% in 2021.
Charities have also been impacted by the COVID crisis. They rely heavily on volunteers and have seen their ranks deeply cut. One reason for that, older people tend to volunteer in large numbers, but have been avoiding social situations due to being most at risk. So while donations are actually up, charities lack the manpower to get that help where it's needed most.
Checking that all coronavirus guidelines are being followed. This means no more than 3 people allowed in at a time. This Resto de Corps food bank outside Paris must adapt to the pandemic.
It's a little longer, but it's understandable. We wait a little longer, and that's all. We don't want to infect people who are volunteering their time.
But the coronavirus's second wave is impacting the volunteers. Several team members are taking a break from the organization.
We have volunteers who are of a certain age and have health concerns, and given the state of the hospitals now, they prefer to stay at home because they're more susceptible.
Of the 73,000 volunteers that work for Resto de Corps nationwide, around 30,000 fall into the higher risk category. But with an increased demand for the charity's services, many still choose to help out while making sure they follow extra safety measures.
I only touch what's there and I hand it over. I have my gloves. If they touch it, they take it. That's why we show them, so they decide whether they want it or not. It's true that we want to protect them, but we also want to protect ourselves.
The assistance of available volunteers allows the distribution center to continue operating. During the first lockdown, it had to close, but nationally, some locations have not been able to implement the new safety standards.
In many cities, we're looking for premises which are better suited to accommodating people, given future weather conditions. We've also asked various municipalities to help us find new centres.
The charity is also worried about the impact the health crisis could have on donations, especially during the holiday period, the most important time for collecting big gifts.
The French government is trying to counter the economic damage from the coronavirus. It's introduced a series of measures aimed at helping those most in need. But some organizers say that help isn't getting to the right people and are calling for change.
€1,800,000,000. It's the sum the French government has marked out to finance Act 2 of its poverty plan. This on top of the €1.5 billion of state funds already spent at the beginning of the epidemic. French Prime Minister Jean Castex gave details on the new measures while visiting homelessness charity Emmaus's headquarters. The new poverty plan seeks to give a one-off payment of €150 to those receiving benefits, as well as €100 per child in the family. 4 million households are set to benefit from this. Also receiving the payment of €150, students on scholarships and under 25-year-old non-students who receive housing benefits. The plan also seeks to create 30,000 new jobs within social insertion schemes by 2022. But NGOs say the government's financial response is insufficient to combat the country's poverty. Some are pointing to US welfare payments as an example. Up to $3,000, or about €2,500, is allocated to help the very poorest households.
Christophe Devys, thank you so much for joining us here on France 24. You are the president of the Alerte collective, which is a group of 35 anti-poverty charities. We are talking about 1 million people who could become newly poor. Your organization works to help these people. What kind of state of mind are you seeing that they're in?
Many people are scared of falling into poverty, and the poorest are scared they'll never be able to leave it. Because they can clearly see what is involved in a dynamic of integration and progression towards employment, and they see that employment is going to become more and more scarce. So there's a lot of concern just over what a poor person goes through every day, like being able to eat, pay rent, or seeing an upsurge in unpaid rent, and pay electricity bills, etc.
What other types of people are in this precarious group?
We've mentioned young people, families with young children, but lots of other people are affected by this health crisis, namely the elderly and the disabled. For financial reasons, we saw that elderly or disabled people had a lot of difficulty feeding themselves properly during the first lockdown. But the other issue which should especially draw our attention is the one of isolation. The isolation of elderly people is, like in many places across the world, very prevalent in France, maybe even more so. And it's made worse by the health crisis because people can no longer go out anymore.
You spoke of young people being particularly impacted, but do you think that the government and society recognizes that, or have they been a bit forgotten?
What we saw appear more starkly at the start of the health crisis and over lockdown were young people in poverty. Poverty has always existed among young people. Their poverty rate is much higher, around 20 to 25%, than the overall poverty rate, which is around 15%. But it's not always visible, because young people live very discreetly. And today we know that young people will be particularly impacted by the economic situation because employment has decreased and so has casual work. This is going to be a lasting change. So we absolutely need strong measures for young people. What we say is there should be a general right for all young people, a right to assistance. And on top of that, there must be a right to a fund equivalent to the minimum wage or to the income support benefit.
And what do you and the charities that you work with expect from the government when it comes to the poorest people? What more do you think they need to be doing?
What we expect from the government is that it accepts that the social crisis is going to be lasting, that the crisis that's unfolding in front of us is structural. So we expect that the government take that into account so that they make structural reforms. Reforms that mean the poorest in society have an income that allows them to live with dignity. So they need to raise the income support benefit by 20 or 25%. We don't understand the government's policy, which consists of handing out financial help ad hoc, as if it were a charity. It's a strong word, but it is just that. They handed out charity money in March and again in the autumn. But it's not the same thing as saying that the poorest people have a right to live with dignity, and the government has a pressing obligation to enshrine this right.
That's all for this edition. Thanks so much for watching, and do stay tuned to France 24.